In this tutorial, we're going to create this sword using extruded polygons. And in order to do so, we're going to have to develop a free image plane with an image of the sword on it so we can get the proportions and scale as we would like them to be. I'm going to start by creating a free image plane. I'll hold down my spacebar, go to Create, and there is Free Image Plane. A wireframe box will appear on the screen. With it selected, I'll go to my attribute editor. And if you look at the attribute editor, you'll see that there is a folder, not unlike our texture mapping when we bring in our textures for geometry. I'll click on the yellow folder, and I'll go to my proprietary folder, and in there I'm going to choose a picture of the art that will give me a reference for scale and proportion. Now that I've got my image on my free image plane, I'm going to drop the alpha gain to 0.5 to give it a bit of transparency, so in the event if my geometry intersects with the free image plane, I'll still be able to see the geometry. Now I also need to get the thickness on this, so I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Command D, and then I'll hit W on the keyboard, and I'm going to go to my channel box, and I'm going to rotate that second image plane 90 degrees. Now it's pretty subjective how you would want to set these up. I'm going to put this over here like this, so that whatever angle I'm in, I can see the flat view, and then I can go in here and I can see the side view. I'm going to select both of them, and I'm going to put them on their own layer, clicking on the layer icon with the flat face, poly face. I'm going to click on the icon with the flat poly face and the blue sphere. And it'll add that element to the layer, and when I turn it on and off, I can hide this at will, and I'm going to name it, and now I can turn it on and off, or if I go to the third box over on the layer window itself, the one that is empty, I can click on that twice, and it'll give me my planes and make them inaccessible so that won't move around while I'm in the modeling process. I'm going to start with a polygon cube. I'll go to Create, Polygon Primitives, Cube, and I'll begin by roughing in a shape that will give me a flat, tall, rectangular piece of geometry. And then I'll go into one of my side views, and I'll start to line this up with the reference art. I'm going to start to roughly scale this in this view. I'm not so worried about the width of the sword in this view as far as the thickness. I'll deal with that as I finish up this view that I'm working on now. I'm going to be using my polygon extrude tool to develop most of this, and then I'll go back and refine it a bit using the edge loop tool. So I'll start by selecting the face. That will give me the top of the sword, and once again I'm going into my orthographic view, and I'll scale it up to right before the sword starts to arc for the tip. I'll click on the extrude polygon tool. I'll hit F on the keyboard to get a little closer, and I'm going to drag it up to where the tip would be. And I'm going to scale it, but I'm not going to close it out because I'll be able to run the edge loop to give the sword more of a blade like we see in the side view here. I'm going to hit 4 on the keyboard so I can see my template below. And I'm going to start extruding the section below where the blade ends, the handle starts to appear. I'm going to go to my perspective view, and I'll select the face at the very bottom. I'll return to this view, and I'll click on my extrude poly tool, and I'll start to pull this down a bit, and I'm going to flare it out. I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard, and I'm going to go to the ghost button, which is the 2 interlocking white boxes, and now we can see through the geometry and we can see our template. I'll hit G, or I'll click back on the polygon extrude tool, and I'll pull that section down. Hitting G again, I'll pull it down to where it starts to arc in again, and I'll grab the scale tool and pull it in like that. I'll hit G, and I'm going to drag it down past where these 2 wings appear, down to where the handle guard starts to appear here. And I'll pretty much do the same thing I had done on top. I'll hit G, I'll pull it down, scale it out, and so on. So I'm just dropping in a very general shape to define the profile of the sword. I'll hit G one more time to get the handle all the way down. I'll come down to there, hit G again, come down to that point, scale that out. I'll hit G again. Now you don't have to worry about putting all these lines in because we can always go back and we can supplement using the edge loop tool, but you may want to add as much as you can once you become comfortable with the tool. And I'll just scale this right from the center because I know it tapers at the bottom there. And if I was to go to 5 on my keyboard and take the ghost off, we can see, and I'll turn off the template, you can see how quickly we were able to put that piece together. And next we're going to be adding those little wings that appear inside of our template on either side using the extrude tool as well. I'm going to return to my perspective view and I'm going to select the area I think I need to extrude those wings. Now this is where I'm going to use the edge loop tool to add a line across this area so that I can extrude these pieces out. So I'll do this in my orthographic view just so it's clear what's going on here. So the edge loop tool is under mesh tools and there's insert edge loop, and it appears on your dock, this box with a vertical orange line on the left. I'll click on it and I'll put an edge loop right in there, and that's going to give me access to polygon faces on either side here. So I'm going to go to my perspective view to do so. I'll right click and I'll choose face. I'll select this one, shift select this one, and now I'll click on my extrude poly tool, and I'm going to go to my orthographic view again because now if I start to pull on my z-axis, you can see it's doing both edges at one time. And once I kind of get the length I think I need, I'll start to scale it a little bit and then I'll pull them down. Now you'll notice what's going on, that when I have both of these still selected, you'll see that they're going in opposite directions. So what I'm going to do is I'll hit Command Z and I'm going to click on the little blue dial that you see in the upper right hand corner of the extrude tool, and it centers that tool. So now when I pull down, they both change equally on either side in a symmetrical manner. Now I want to rotate these edges a bit because I would like to extrude down so that I can bring the next poly faces up for the end of the wing. So I'm going to go in here and I'll just do these manually. I'll go to vertex, I'll select these vertices, I'll hit E, and I'm just going to kind of rotate it like that, and I'll do the same for this. You can always hit 4 on the keyboard if you need to look at your reference art to kind of get what you're looking for. And now I'm ready to extrude those faces once again. I'll go to my perspective view. I'll right click, choose face, select that face, and then one on the other side. I'll go once again to my orthographic view. I'll click on my extrude poly tool and I'll start to pull that out, and you'll see both of them come out at the same time. I'm going to leave this one here, and then I'll go over to this one and I'm going to rotate it. I want these roughly to be against the edge of that drawing that we're using as our reference. Now we're ready to extrude the top of these surfaces up. I'll go to my perspective view. I'll choose I'll choose faces. I'll select them. Back to my orthographic view. I'll click on my extrude tool and then I'll start to pull them up. And I'll start to flare them out a bit. And I'm kind of just making them big enough so that I know if I start to rotate those surfaces to match these planes, they'll be in the right spot. So I'm going to hit 4 because the wireframe is going to be helpful. I'll go to vertices And I'll grab this side first. I'll get my rotation tool and I'll rotate that plane. I'll hit W to move it into position. And if you wanted to, now you could start to tweak these a bit. And just going back and forth with my move and rotate tool, and then I'll just put these where I'd like them to be. And now let's return to our perspective view and see what we have so far. So I'll turn off the template. You can see already we've got the basic shape roughed in. All we need to do is a little bit more detail, and then we'll add a texture map to it. Now I've roughed in the basic sword, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to put an edge loop in the side view so that I can kind of shape this a little bit more to the contour of a sword. I'll click on my edge loop tool. I'll click here and you'll see it runs that path all the way around. Now I'm going to round these edges off a bit, and I need to preface the rest of this in the context of a game asset. I'm being very conscious of my polygon count, and I've put up my polygon face count, and I've done that once again by going to display, heads up display. You'll see poly count, and you'll see that my shape has only got 124 polygons. And that means it would function very well in a game environment. Now as we proceed with this, we'll add our texture map, and then depending on what your needs are, you may go back and add more detail, but you're going to find that when we apply that texture that we actually used for our template, that it's going to make it pretty convincing that this is a sword. Next, I'm going to grab the edges of the blade on all four sides on the outer edge, and I'm going to scale them to give this a little bit of a contour of what a sword might really look like. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose edge. I'll select the top edge here, and then I'll shift select this one. Now if I wanted to go all the way through, I could also go down a little further, and if I hold my shift and double click down to here, it takes that whole edge. So I'm going to hit 4 on the keyboard, and when I do, you can see that that brown line is defining the edge I want to select. I'm going to do that to the other 3 around the perimeter of my shape. I'll hold my shift key in the meantime. I'll click the top. I'll double click on this one. That one's selected. I'll go to the next one, and I'll hit 5 on the keyboard. Perhaps it's easier to see what's going on when I do this. I'll double click on this one. I'll do the same for this edge. Make sure you keep your finger on the shift key so you don't lose what you did. And now I'm going to go to my top view. I'll hit F on the keyboard, and I'm going to hit R to get my scale tool. And I'll start by pulling it in, like so. And I'll pull it back. I think I'll leave it just like that. All right, so now if I go and look at my perspective view, you can see now I'm starting to get that roundness that the blade would have. Now if I hit 3 on the keyboard, it kind of rounds it off, and that's not what I want, but I'm working for a game environment, so I would never add a poly count that would round that off. It would just bump it up too high. I'm going to go in and add a few more edge loops just to refine the shape a bit, and then I'm going to add my texture map to it. I'll do so by going to my side view of my sword in its orthographic view. I'm going to zoom in at the top. I'll click on the edge loop tool, and I'm going to turn the template back on so I can kind of see the shape of this. I'll click on that edge loop again, and now I'll drop a path maybe here, get my scale tool, pull it out, hit G to get the edge loop again. Maybe I'll put one in here. Very sparingly I'm putting these elements in because I know that the texture map will really define the shape of this quite well for a game environment. Again, something that has to have a very low polygon count. You can see that that number here is very, very low. I've got 136 faces, which is really very good for a game environment. I'm going to turn off the template, And the last thing I want to do is make that tip of that sword a point. I'll right click and choose vertex. I'll select the vertices at the very tip, and I'm going to use the edit mesh tool, merge to center. If I were to put on my dock, it would look like this orange circle that you see here. I'll click on it. I'll hit Command S to save. I'll hit A on my keyboard so that I can zoom in on my sword. Now I'm ready to add my texture. But before I do, I think I'm going to round off the handle a bit here, just as I did the edge of the blade. I'm going to right click, choose edge, and then I'm going to shift select the edges on the outside of the handle area. Now, I may want to round off down here where it's more of a knob shape, so I'll add those as well. I'll get my scale tool and I'll scale it in a little bit. You can see now we're getting a shape that more resembles the roundness that that handle would need. I may want to do this section up here as well. Now I'll right click and choose object mode. I'm going to go to the side view where I'm looking at the sword again. Now we're going to add our texture map. Hitting 5 on the keyboard, I can right click on my geometry now and add a new material. Choosing Arnold, AI standard surface. I'll go to the texture itself. And you can see it took me quite a while to get to the surface itself. I've done editing this, so I'm going to click on delete by type history. You'll see it reduces that history and makes it a lot easier getting to your actual texture node. I'll go down to the color tab, click on the checkerboard, and under create render node, click on checker. Hit 6 on the keyboard. We'll see some representation of the texture. The z-axis, the axis which we will choose to add our planar mapping. With the geometry in the object mode, hold down the space bar, go to UV, planar, and its attributes. Make sure it's set for Z, and hit apply. If you recall, in order to make sure we get the perfect square checkerboard pattern in a planar view, we need to return to the channel box. Down at the bottom of the input, you'll see projection width and height. Make both of those the same number. I'm going to choose 8 and hit return. I'll return to my object mode, and I'm going to go to the UV texture editor. If you recall, the UV texture editor is a little green box with a checkerboard pattern in it. If it's not on your shelf, you can go to UVs, and at the top of that drop-down menu is UV editor. Remember that by holding Command Shift, you can add any of your tools to your shelf if you choose. Once I click on it, I'll see the representation of the UV map inside that checkerboard pattern. Now I'm going to move the UV texture map that I just made off to the right, because we're going to play with the handle and try to texture map the side view of the handle area to make it a little bit more convincing. And if we were to go in and add another UV map here, what we'd end up with is 2 UV maps, one on top of the other, and it'd make them hard to separate out. So I'll right click and choose UV shell. I'll select it, hit W, and I'll pull that off to the side. I'll return to my model. And in the perspective view, I'm going to select just the handle area. I'm going to select just the polygon faces in the side view of the handle. I'll hit 4 on the keyboard to substantiate that I have just the faces I want. And on the x-axis, I'm going to put planar mapping. I'll hold down the space bar. I'll go to UV, planar mapping, attributes, and I'm going to set it for X. I'll hit apply. And then in the channel box, I'll set the projection width and height to the same 8 increment that I did for the front view of the sword. And now that they're perfectly proportional. Now it's a matter of putting these side by side and then right-clicking, choosing UV shell. I'll select both of them. With my move tool, I'll put them into the checkerboard area. I'll hit R on the keyboard to get my scale tool, and I'll scale it down. Now I may zoom in a little bit closer, and maybe I'll just move this up a little bit so it's more in line. This is all something to be dealt with the texture map. Now in order to export this planar UV map, I need to return to my object mode, my geometry, reselect my geometry, and then in the UV editor, I'm going to go to Image, UV Snapshot. I'll direct it to my folder with my project, and I will give it a name. And I will click on Apply and Close. And now we will go in Photoshop and we'll plot our texture map. I've opened up Photoshop, and I've also opened up the texture file on the left and then the UV PNG map that we just generated in Maya. I'm going to change the color of the UV map to something like a red so I can see it distinctly against the texture once I import it into the UV map itself. So I'll lock the transparency, I'll go to my swatches, I'll choose red, and I'll hit Option Delete to change that to red. I'll go to my texture, I'll get my marquee, I'm going to select both the side and the front view. I'll hit Command C to copy, Command W to get rid of it, and then Command V to paste it in my destination. I'll put that layer below the UV. Now before I start to edit the UV and place it where I want it, I'm going to get rid of the white background. So I'll hit W on the keyboard and I'll get my magic wand tool inside of Photoshop. I'll select the white area and I'll hit delete, and then I'll deselect. Now they're both still on the same layer. It'll make it a little easier for me to place these in the proper positions if I separate them out. So once again, I'm going to get my marquee. I'll select the side view. I'll hit Command X and then Command Shift V to put it back in place. And if I look at my layer window now, I have 2 layers. It's going to make it a lot easier now. One other thing I'm going to do before I go any further is I don't want any transparency on the edges if this texture map doesn't fit properly. So I'm going to put a blank layer in. I'll get my eyedropper tool and I'll get a middle value gray that appears on my texture map, and I'll just fill that whole layer with that color and I'll put it below all the other layers. So now you can see our layer order is our UV map at the top, our side view sword, our front view sword, and the gray background. I'm going to start with the side view of the sword, and I'll put that into position like that. I'm going to zoom in on this. And this is not too critical because the texture is not exactly like the geometry. So I'm just going to tweak this a bit so it's at least the right length and the right width. It's always a good idea to go beyond the edges of the actual UV because, as I said before, we don't want any transparency, or we're trying to avoid even that gray we've put as our background. So I'll go a little bit further than the actual width of the side view there. I'm going to put on the front view, and I'll put that into position. And I can see I have to scale that up a little bit. I'll hit Command T, and I'm going to put the hot point or the center pivot down at the very bottom because I've got the bottom in place where I want. But if I look up at the top now, I can see that I've got to go a little further with the art to cover the tip. I'll hold the Shift key, drag from a corner until the sword is the same height, and I'll move it over to fit more closely to the UV map, and then I'm going to hit return, hide the UV map, Command S to save. Now we're ready to go back into Maya. Now that we're back in Maya, I'll select my sword, right click, choose Material Attributes. In my Material Attributes, I'm going to right click on the word color and choose Break Connection. I'll go back out through the checkerboard again, as I added my checker before, and this time I'll choose File, and I'll follow the image name out through Folder, and I will go to my texture, and now my texture has been applied to my geometry. Now if I need to tweak this in any way, I could always go into the UV editor, and I can do some fine-tuning there if I wanted to. So if I had any gray perhaps showing through as down here or on the front, I can always go into the UV map now in the editor. In this case, I'm going to right click and choose UV. I'll select the UVs here, and I'll just scale them in so that the texture occupies the geometry in its entirety. Now if I were to go over here and check, I'm not seeing too much gray. I could go back and adjust this even further. But there's no need to go back into Photoshop because now I could do any kind of editing on that texture map in my UV editor.